Okay, so now Solomon is going to get to this second bit of advice. That's what we're going to look at tonight in finishing up lesson 11 and then going into lesson number 12. And so if you look there on verse number 1, he goes on with this second bit of advice by saying this. He says, remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before the days of trouble come and the years approach when you will say, I find no pleasure in them. Okay? So his second bit of advice is, first of all, to remember your Creator. Okay, so hang on a second. Let me transition to this screen right here. Now, when he said something about to remember your Creator in your days of your youth, what is this talking about? Well, if you look at your lesson material, this expression, remember, refers to a person realizing God's lordship over his life because of God being the Creator and then obeying Him. Now, that's remembering the Lord. Earlier, he talked about to remember the days of darkness, okay? But when you're talking about remembering your Creator in your days of your youth, it's not just simply you go, oh yeah, I remember my Creator. It's not that. It goes beyond that. It's recognizing, realizing, about God, about God's existence. But you can't just simply recognize and realize about God and that's it. There's some people who say, oh yeah, I believe in God, and they think that is good enough. But James points out that even the devils believe that God is one and tremble, but it's that doesn't go so far, right? You got to have more than that. It's great that you believe that there's a God. Great that you believe that God is one, but you got to take it further than that. And the way that you take it further than that is you stop and think, okay, well, since God does exist, then what does that mean for me in my life? You see, that's where that remembering is okay, here is God, here's my Creator, but what does that mean for me? And so we've got this lordship over our lives because of His being the Creator, and then therefore from that, then we're going to go on and obey Him. And so that's what Solomon is giving here. He's saying this to all the young men, remember your Creator in your days of your youth. Now he goes on to, in verses 2 through 5, he starts to speak very poetically and depressingly, talk about using the illusions of nature in a town closing down in the evening and mixing in references to the elderly all in one. Okay, so get your cheerful hat on because we're gonna read it here in verse number 2. In verse number 2, it says this, that is, go back to remember your Creator. Before the sun and the light and the moon and the stars grow dark and the clouds return. Hold on a second. I'm starting to feel my aged eyes. There we go. Oh, that's much better. Before the sun and the light and the moons grow and stars grow dark and the clouds return after the rain, when the keepers of the house tremble and the strong men stoop, when the grinders cease because they are few and those looking through the windows grow dim, when the doors of the street are closed and when the sound of the grinding fades, and when men rise up at the sound of birds but all their songs grow faint, when men are afraid of heights and dangers in the streets, when the almond tree blossoms and the grasshopper drags himself along, and then desire no longer is stirred, then man goes to eternal home and mourners go about in the streets. Very poetic references here, and he's saying that before, and there's this image of a little village is starting to go from daylight to dusk, and then start to go into night, and so the village is starting to shut down here. And maybe this village is at a time maybe in the fall. You notice that he says that the grasshopper is dragging himself along, and so during the day it's warm, and so the grasshopper is jumping around. But especially in the fall, the evenings start to get dark, and so the grasshopper is now starting to drag himself along. You notice that he goes on to talk about how that the keepers of the house tremble and the strong men stoop. And so you have the idea about, age, especially with men. And when the grinder cease because they're few, some people say in one interpretation of this is going to be teeth, that people's teeth are falling out, their molars. And so, the grinding is going to stop because they're few. Another interpretation of that could be that the women that are at the mill that are grinding grain are done with their grain, and so they've stopped their work and they're going home. But you can kind of look at that. All of this is saying, you got to remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before all of these things happen, before you start to get to the point where you don't have a lot of vim and vigor in your life. You don't have a lot of vitality. You don't have these dreams. You don't have a lot of energy, and you're starting to to be on the decline, so to speak. So when you look at Solomon, and then he goes on to talk about the full scope of human life. Hold on a second. Let me make sure that I'm where I'm at here. The full scope of life. You notice in verse number 6 and 7 that he goes back to the main point by start to talk about this again. In verse number 6, he says this: remember him before the silver cord is severed, or the golden bowl is broken, before the pitcher is shattered at the spring, or the broken wheel at the well, and the dust returns from the ground it came from, and the spirit returns to God who gave it. Meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher. Everything is meaningless. And so when we take a look at these verses, we see that he's going back to emphasize poetically again about how we need to serve our Creator in the days of our youth before all of these things start to break down. Now he goes on to talk about comparing death to tools being broken. That is, lamps, pitchers, and wheels. There he says, remember him before the silver cord is severed, before the golden bowl is broken, before the pitcher is shattered at the spring, or the wheel broken at the well. And so here we've got all these different tools that are being used, right? And so these tools are fine when they're working and they're serving their function. But then all of a sudden these tools break, and when they break, like the wheel at the well, like the pitcher at the spring, so on and so forth, then they're not useful anymore. And so he goes on to talk about this. And that is, and dust returns to the ground where it came from, and the dust returns to the ground where it came from, and the spirit returns to God who gave it. One thing that we need to understand is that we are eternal beings. I mean, once we die, that's not the end of us. What we have right now, as far as this body is concerned, this body is just simply a vessel that is in which our spirits occupy. And so just like, a wheel that's broken, a pitcher that's broken, a golden bowl that's broken, when our bodies hit death, it's like this body becomes broken, and then the spirit no longer has this body as a tool anymore. And so this spirit is therefore going to go back to return to God who gave it. Now, before we get any further, we need to understand that this is not talking about, and it's not differentiating between heaven or hell. It's not that, okay, we're, eternal beings, we're here in this body. Once we die, we're automatically going to go and be with the Lord in heaven. No, that's not what this is referring to at all. It's just simply saying that in life under the sun, once we hit death, this life ends, but yet the spirit is going to move on. And it's going to move on, as what we're going to talk about in just a little bit. It's going to move on to judgment. Okay? All right. Now, moving on to the next page here. Next page, let's talk about some questions. All right? Again, we're on a 25-second delay. Okay, so 25-second delay. So, if you've got some of the questions to these or answers to these questions, if you want to put them in the blank below, then that will be that'll be great. Okay, so question number 1: Solomon talked about remembering God in youth. Is there a time that would be too old to start remembering God? Okay, and so while we're waiting on that 24-second delay, and you're thinking about it and putting it into the blank there. Remember that Solomon was older when he wrote this, and he was really speaking to younger people. We go back to the very first chapter. This is Solomon as teacher. He's speaking primarily to youth, and he's trying to encourage them. And so, he's saying, remember the Creator in the days of your youth. And I think that some people might say, okay, well, I'm beyond youth. I've got my glasses and everything like that. So does that mean that I'm too late to remember God? I haven't done it to this point, and so I've kind of missed the boat, missed out at everything. Is there going to be a time where it's too late? You're too old. You can't start remembering God. So what do you think? I'm waiting for some comments to pop up down here.
Maybe it depends on how your heart is. If your heart is hardened or not, then it's too late, maybe. But if your heart is still soft to accepting God, then maybe you can still remember Him.
Okay. And so I think Shannon's got a good point here. Is that as far as being too old, it's not a question of your age. It is and always has been a question about the condition of your heart. Sometimes when somebody's heart is so hardened, they can't go on and take a look at the good things that God has given us. Mary Ann says, no, I don't think so, but I can't think of a verse. Mary Ann, you were absolutely right. I read that and I was thinking, the very follow-up to that is, can you think of any biblical examples? And I was just really, really thinking,
what about King Saul with David? Like, his heart hardened. I mean, is he an example of it?
But I don't think it's because of his age. I think it's because of who he was.
His heart, yeah.
Yeah. And Sandra says, never too old. And I think you're right. I don't think that there is an age. I don't think that you can never be too old, okay? And I think that when we look at Solomon here, we can see that, Solomon started out really good in his life. And then he turned bad. He turned away from the Lord. He turned to idols. He did all of those things. But I think that, what you can see here is that Solomon was, really kind of hurt from all this. As a matter of fact, if we go back, I guess we skipped this, but, we go back to the insights box here, about Solomon's qualifications. He started out serving the Lord. He fell away from it. But can't you see from chapter 12 that he returned? And you hear the sound of remorse in his voice, don't you? When you read this of, remember your Creator in your days of your youth. I think that as he was approaching the end of his life, I think that he really realized, hey, I've really, really made some mistakes there. And so he's trying to urge people to follow the Lord. And what's interesting is that, when we get to this about Solomon's advice to others before his death, is like several others that are found in the Bible. Moses, David, Paul, when they approached the end of their lives, they did leave advice for the people that were coming behind them. And all of them had this one thing in common, and that is just simply stay true to the Lord, stay true to following His word. And as we're going to see, that's pretty much what Solomon is talking about too. Now, as far as can you think of biblical examples? So going back to this. Can you think of any biblical examples? I can't think of biblical examples of somebody who was not following the Lord up until a point, and then, they said, okay, in my old age, I'm going to follow the Lord. I mean, there may be one out there, and if you know of something, you can put it in the blank. But the reference that I thought of was the thief on the cross. Mm-hmm. And I don't know that, the thief on the cross was that old. I mean, he may have been, just middle-aged. I mean, I have no idea how old he was. But as far as, the relativity in his life, he was on his last legs. Okay, he was he was in his last hours, literally. And at that point, he turned to the Lord, and the Lord saved him. So, there is not a there is too old thing. Okay? All right. So moving on to the next question, and that is, why would Solomon urge his listeners to remember God in their youth? What advantages are there to serving God earlier in life rather than later? Now, I'm just going to go ahead, and for time's sake, I'm just going to go ahead and jump in here. And that is that, one reason for advantages of serving God earlier rather than later is obvious. I mean, the earlier you serve God, the more you can do for God, right? If you wait till later, you just may not be able to serve God and have the same effect in your life as you would at a younger time. I remember that when I was pastoring in Corning, we had men's meeting. There was one deacon there. His name was Dude Arnold. Really good guy, really good deacon. But he had a pretty rough early life and was saved later, and then was baptized, good church member, became a deacon, everything like that. But I remember one night, he said, "I did the one thing I just really, really regret is that I didn't come to know the Lord earlier in my life." And I'm thinking, well, I'm glad you did. I mean, from my perspective, of course, I was just something years old at the time. I was thinking, man, you've been serving the Lord a whole lot longer than I have, so that's a good thing. But I've talked to other people, later on since then, and that's one thing that they kind of have regrets on. Is just simply, I wish I would have served the Lord earlier. I wish I would have had more of an impact on people. And, so I think, as far as whether you start serving the Lord later in life or whether you start serving the Lord earlier in life, the important thing is that you start serving the Lord, right? But, there's no better time to start than right now. Okay. Moving on to the next question. I know I'm kind of going through these quickly, but I want to get to these so we can get into the next chapter or the next lesson. Remembering God is recognizing His lordship over life. And of course, this isn't something that, you wouldn't have to necessarily put in blank, but I just want you to think about this. And that is, what are some specific things that would entail for your life? Okay. And so I know you don't have to put stuff in the comments box and just bear it to, all the internet world to see. But just think about that for a minute of, okay, well, if I need to remember the Lord, that is, I need to recognize His lordship over my life and follow Him, what does that look like specifically for me? Now, as far as Solomon goes, specifically for him would have been to say, hey, you know what? I've had all of these foreign wives. They've led my heart astray. I have messed up my legacy for my kingdom. And I've left some really hard things for my sons to follow. So what I need to do now is I need to set the record straight, and which I think is what he's trying to do with Ecclesiastes. One thing that you need to do is you need to set the record straight as far as, what he did with the idolatrous temples that he had constructed. And it really doesn't say in the Bible what he did with them. I mean, he may have not have done anything with them, but, I do think that he had regrets over it. But how much of those regrets translated into actions, I don't know. But I think that one thing, and this is kind of where Ecclesiastes is coming into play, is that, Ecclesiastes, this whole book, has been looking at life under the sun. What is our perspective of life from the time that we're born to the time that we die? And if we are the center of that, if we are the focus of it, and we're just simply living life for what we can get out of it, there's going to come a point in time where we realize what Solomon realized, is that it's meaningless. Instead of that, what we need to do is remember the Lord, remember our Creator, and then start to say, hey, you know what? God's got a bigger plan. God's got a bigger purpose than just simply me here living for myself. And with His mercy and His grace, I can do that. Okay? And so then the last question, how well are you recognizing God in your life? Would recognizing God affect the way that you view life? Would you see it as meaningless or meaningful? And, again, you don't have to put comments in the blank, but, I think that if we do recognize God in our life, then we do see it as meaningful. Kind of what we've been talking about here. And if you recall, this was way back in the very early days of us looking at things, is that, we have man, we have humanity, and that the approach of Ecclesiastes is that, we are the center of our own universe, and that God exists, but that God exists over here, and that God is over here, we're over here, and then when God is doing things to get our attention, then oftentimes those are troubling things that kind of hurt us. Instead of all of that, hey, that kind of looks like eyeglasses, doesn't it? Okay. Shannon's looking at me perplexedly because she can't see what I just drew. But instead of that, what we're talking about is that God should be the center of our universe, and we should be revolving around Him, okay? And so when we look at it like this, which of these two really make more sense? And that is it this right here? Let me get rid of all of that. Or is it this down here? Is it this or this? This is going to equal the meaningless. This, on the other hand, is going to be equaling the meaningful. Okay? Because with this, we are living to the purpose that God has created for us to begin with. All right? Okay. If you got questions about that, put those in the blank. And we are now going to move on to lesson number 12. Okay? All right. Lesson number 12. So lesson number 12 is kind of the end of Ecclesiastes. If you remember the very beginning of Ecclesiastes, it started out with a simple statement of the words of the teacher. Okay? And so King of Jerusalem. And so there was the beginning. And then here from that, chapter 1, verse number 2, all the way through chapter 12 in verse number 8, here we've got the words of the teacher, the words of Solomon that are there. And then this is going to kind of wrap everything up. It's going to be a concluding statement that is going to tie everything in together, okay? And so without this section, we really don't have a good grasp on the book of Ecclesiastes. It really is something that's incomplete, and it really leaves us with a very hopeless feeling. I mean, there at the end of verse number 8, everything is meaningless. That is just a really very hopeless thing to end on. And so without this, then we really don't get the point to it all. And if you recall, what I've been talking about here with all of this is simply saying, we've got these different conclusions that Solomon draws. First of all, is he says that everything is meaningless, right? Because, everything comes to an end. Second conclusion that he draws is that what you need to do is enjoy what you can, because if you think about, life here now under the sun, first of all, everything's going to be meaningless because everything's going to be taken away from you at the point of your death. So therefore, what you need to do is you need to enjoy what you can while you can do it, okay? But then we've got this third conclusion, which is simply this. Okay? And if you think about these conclusions, if you take these conclusions just simply, if you take this one without this one, then you've got, a life of depression and darkness, right? So you got to have this one to go and complement this. But if you take this one in and of itself without coming and reaching this conclusion right here, then you've got a life that really is back to meaningless, right? And so you've got to take each one of these individually. You've got to understand that, yeah, life under the sun is meaningless as far as just simply the things that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. And so, yeah, we do need to enjoy the blessings that God gives us while we can. But at the same time, what we need to do is we need to remember God, okay? And really, that's kind of what this lesson is all about and kind of ties everything up, okay? All right, so looking at the last word on the man in Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verses 9 and 10. You notice that it says this. It says in verse number 9, verse number 10, it says, not only was the teacher wise, but he also imparted knowledge to the people. He pondered and searched out and set in order many proverbs. The teacher searched out to find just the right words, and what he wrote was upright and true. And so this is just kind of a concluding statement on the man Solomon. And this man Solomon was, as what the Bible says, the wisest man that really has ever lived, with the exception of Jesus Christ. And, Jesus has a little bit of an advantage there because he's the Son of God. And so, when you look at Solomon, Solomon was an extremely wise individual. And you notice that this teacher was wise. He imparted knowledge. He pondered and searched out and set in order many proverbs. And, when we looked at chapters 10, a little bit of chapter 11, and then back before that, I think it was in chapter 7, we looked at two different sets of those proverbs that Solomon gave to us. And then we've got the book of Proverbs as well. And so we've got all of these things, and you notice that what he wrote was upright and true. So there's kind of a summation about the man himself, a last word on the man. And then in verses 11 through verse number 14, we've got, the last word on his message as well. Okay, so in verse number 11, you notice the content of what Solomon wrote is compared to two different things here. One is this. He says, the words of the wise are like goads, their collected sayings like firmly embedded nails given by one shepherd. Okay, and so we've got two different illustrations. We've got number one, goads, and number two, nails. Okay, so you know what a goad is? Like an ox goad? Yeah, it's like, if this was a long rod, and you just, hey, when we take Twix on a walk, maybe I need to have a little goad for you. Get along, Twix. I don't need to do that with Twix because Twix is usually pulling me down the trail. I don't want to give her more incentive to go. But if Twix, yeah, if Twix was a big stubborn ox that was tired of working, you might need to give it a little bit more motivation there to get going. And so the words of the wise, he says here, are kind of like these goads, if you will. We don't like it. It's not pleasant, but sometimes we need to be prodded into action. We need to have that motivation, even if it's kind of a, I don't want to say negative motivation. It's a painful motivation, of to get us to do some of the things that we need to do, and it's what we really need to do for ourselves. And then that second illustration there is nails, and so if you think about what a nail does, a nail is going to anchor things down. It's going to kind of latch onto it, and so the words of the wise are going to be goads. It's going to get us going in one direction, and then once we're there, it's going to be an anchor. It's going to kind of get us right where we need to be. Okay, and so this is what Solomon is saying. Then if you look at verse number 12, it goes on to say this. It says that, be warned, my son, of anything in addition to them, of making many books there is no end, and much study wearies the body. And so, when you think about trying to figure all this stuff out on life, trying to figure out all the things that are going on, it really is something that's going to be very wearisome to the body. If you've you probably have experienced this too. You know, when you've got some kind of problem, you're trying to figure out what's going on, what the meaning of it is, everything like that. You just can't do it. You just, it just wears on you, it just wears you out. And so, that's kind of what he's been doing with the book of Ecclesiastes, is he tried been figuring out this purpose and the meaning to life. And, the meaning to life is something that is very complex, and so complex that we really can't figure out all these things that are going on of life under the sun. But at the same time, there is a very simple denominator, and that is to, again, remember the Lord. Now, before we go on and look more about that, I want you to take a look at this little insights box right here, okay? Because sometimes I think that, some people say, well, what in the world is the book of Ecclesiastes even doing in the Bible anyway? Because it is a book that is unlike a lot of the other books that are there, okay? So the Bible as being a collection of 66 books that God inspired, and there's the key. It's not that we did it. It's that God inspired it to be done over that 1,500-year time period. But as people were taking all of these books that God inspired over that long time period, they began to combine them together, and they started to say, okay, is this something that God has inspired, or is this something that people have just written, okay? And so as they were trying to find these books and recognize whether God inspired them or not, they were looking for marks of inspiration. And I want you to stop and look at verses 9 through 12 here. Oops, sorry about that. Take a look at verses 9 through 12. And look at the different marks of inspiration that we have in Ecclesiastes. First thing is that it claims to have knowledge and wisdom. Second thing is that it claims to be upright and true, using just the right words. And then last but not least, its claims were God-given by one shepherd. Looking at verse 9 again, through verse number 12, it says, not only was the teacher wise, but that he imparted knowledge to the people. He pondered and searched out and set in order many proverbs. And so there's that impartation of wisdom. And then in verse number 10, it says, the teacher searched to find just the right words, and what he wrote was upright and true. Not what he wrote was ambiguous and could have been a little bit considered. But no, it was something that was upright. And it was something that's truthful, something that you could put your faith in. And then you notice that all these words and these collections, may be goads to us, but you notice that they were given by one shepherd, and that shepherd is God. It's not Solomon. Solomon is the king, but God was the one that anointed him king. And so, just like a pastor should be an under shepherd of a church, but Jesus is the chief shepherd in the nation of Israel. The king was kind of the under shepherd, but the shepherd was the Lord. And so this given by one shepherd is God. And so what this means is that, the book of Ecclesiastes is inspired just like any other book. Okay? All right, so moving on to the last page and continuing on with this last little message that's here. You notice that he says this in verse number 12 or 13. He says, now all has been heard. Here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring in every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether it is good or evil. So this goes back to that last conclusion, that third conclusion. That's so very important, because those other two conclusions don't make any sense unless you understand this. And so what he's saying here is that, okay, since everything's now been heard, and like I said, life is a very complex thing and we can't figure out, but there is a simple thing that we can understand, and that is this, and that is the conclusion of the matter is fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. And, as far as like the meaning of life, people say, well, what's the meaning of life? What's the meaning of life? If this isn't the meaning of life, I don't know what is. I think this is going to come closer to the real true meaning of our life here and now on this earth more than any other thing. And that is that, what is it? Well, we need to fear God. That is, we need to have a respect for Him, and we need to keep His commandments. Well, why? Well, it's because He's our Creator, and we need to remember Him in the days of our youth. He's the one who has made us, and He's put us here for a purpose. And so to fulfill that purpose, then we've got to do this right here. And that is that we have to respect Him as being God. And part of that respect is to at least follow Him, at least attempt to obey Him and keep His commandments, because this is what our whole duty is. This is what our whole responsibility of humanity is. Our responsibility is not to make and get of this life what we can, because again, it's going to wind up to be zero when it's all said and done. But if we serve the Lord, if we fear the Lord, if we keep His commandments, if we recognize that this is our duty, what we're here for, then what we can do is we can go on and we can have a life that's meaningful. Okay? And then that last little bit, God's going to bring every deed into judgment, whether it's including every hidden thing, whether it's good or evil. Okay? All right, so moving on to our questions here. And that is, question right here up the top. Will everyone be judged, including Christians? Read 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 10, which is about Jesus judging believers. Okay, so let's flip over there real quick. 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse number 10. Okay, so in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 in verse number 10, it says this: "For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that each one may receive what is due him for the things done in the body, whether it be good or bad." Now, this is a judgment for Christians. If you notice there where he says, "For we all must appear," well, that's the Apostle Paul talking to the Corinthian church. So the Corinthian church are people who are saved, they're going to heaven. The Apostle Paul was saved, he's going to heaven. So he says, "For we must all," he's talking about them. So they all are going to go and stand before the judgment seat of Christ. Now, is there anything about heaven and hell in this passage? And what is this judgment for? Okay? Now, when you look at this, you notice that he says here that we're going to receive what is due him, whether the things done while in the body, whether it be good or whether it's bad. The things that are due us are the things that are owed us. It's the things that are reckoned for us. Salvation, on the other hand, is not something that is worked for and owed, and it is therefore due us. Nobody's going to get to heaven and say, "Well, I'm here because I deserve to be here." We're only going to be in heaven if we recognize the fact that we don't deserve it, and that we are only there by the grace and the mercy that comes from knowing Jesus Christ as our personal Savior and having our sins forgiven. Okay? So, this is not a judgment of whether somebody's going to go to heaven or hell. That is already determined on whether or not we've accepted Jesus Christ. But you notice that this is a judgment for this, and that is the things done in our body, whether it's good or bad. If we are living a life that is meaningful, then that is things that is good. It may not be good as far as what other people consider it, but it's good as far as what God considers it. And since He's the judge, He's the one that's going to make that determination. And so if we do things in this life that are good, then we are going to be rewarded for those things. If, however, we're doing things that are for ourselves, even if we go and we, create empires and kingdoms and everything like that, if it's for ourselves, if it's not for the Lord, if it's not recognizing His lordship in our lives, then when that ends, that's gone. And then we don't have any sort of reward after that. Okay? All right, moving on to the next question. And that is in contrast to this judgment. Then let's take a look at another judgment. Judgment in Revelation chapter 20, verses 11 through 15. Okay, so looking at Revelation chapter 20, verse 11 through 15. Now, this is a judgment of unbelievers. Uh-oh, we just dropped off. Are we still... Okay. You can hear the audio because I'm noticing that we've got a... Okay, well, I don't know what just dropped off there, but I noticed that we dropped off.
Well, I'm 25 seconds behind also.
Okay, well, you're going to be dropping off. Well, by the time that you hear that, it'll be gone. Okay, never mind. So in Revelation chapter 20 and in verse number 11, this is a judgment that is for unbelievers. And I want you to listen to this, and I want you to think about the language, and I want you to think about the intent of what was going on with the other judgment that we just looked at in 2 Corinthians chapter 5. And it says this, it says in verse number 11, and I saw a great white throne, and him who was seated on it. Earth and sky fled from his presence, and there was no place for them. And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and the books were open. Another book was opened, which is the book of life. The dead were judged according to what they had done, as recorded in the books. The sea gave up the dead that were in it, and death and Hades gave up the dead that were in them. And each person was judged according to what he had done. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. The lake of fire is the second death. If anyone's name is not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire. So if you contrast this to what we just looked at, before it was a determination of whether somebody's life was good or bad. This is just simply all these people are there, and if your name's not found in the Lamb's Book of Life, then therefore you are removed and you're cast into the lake of fire for eternity. Okay? So, you look at this, and this is a judgment of works, but the works that are there is a judgment on whether or not somebody has accepted Jesus Christ, whether or not their names are written in the Lamb's Book of Life. And I guess you could kind of see that, here is a collection of people who have been living for themselves all of their life. They haven't been thinking about God. They haven't been thinking about their eternity or what Jesus has done for them. And so, they've amassed all of these things in their lives, and now that they've died, all of those things are left behind, but now they're standing before the Lord in eternal judgment, and they've got their sins to stand on. They have nothing else, and there's no forgiveness of sins because they never accepted Jesus Christ and was and had that going for them. Knowing that, moving on to the next question. Knowing that everyone will be judged, does that increase or decrease your fear of God? Does knowing what judgment you will be at increase or decrease your love for God? Does your love for God and the fear of God go hand in hand together? So we've got a couple of different things here. And that is that we've got a love for God, we've got a fear for God. When you know that everybody's going to be judged, does that increase or decrease your fear for God? It should. If somebody says, oh, now I realize that whether I'm lost, whether I'm saved, I'm still going to have to give an account for my life. That fear of God should increase, right? And I'm not talking about a fear of God as far as being afraid of God, but I'm talking about having a fear of God as far as being, having that respect for the Lord. When we have that respect for the Lord, when we think that we're going to be stand before the Lord in judgment, we should at least say, hey, you know what? I need to remember God. I need to have that respect, right? But at the same time, knowing what judgment you're at should be an increase of your love for God. That is, if you're a child of God. If you're a child of God, if you've accepted Jesus Christ as your Savior, then you should say, well, you know what? Because I know I'm going to be at the judgment seat of Christ instead of the great white throne judgment, and I know that, it's not a judgment of heaven or hell, that I should have an increase of love as well. Now, somebody may be listening to this and saying, hey, I'm going to be at the great white throne judgment, and that just really, really, ticks me off, and it decreases my love for God. Well, if you're falling into that category, don't go there. Instead, you need to realize that God has done and given you the possibility of having such a great, enormous gift of eternal life. I mean, Jesus sacrificed himself so that anybody can have eternal life. Don't allow that to really make you upset and harden your heart, but instead give in to him. But you see, having a love for God and a fear for God, those things can go hand in hand together. We can have a love for God and at the same time have a healthy respect for him as well, which is remembering him. And really that should be what the main thing is. And that is that we should say, okay, well, since God has created me, since God has redeemed me, then therefore I love him and I respect him because of everything that, the creator of the heavens and the earth is doing for me. And then the last question is, can you contrast a love for God and a love for self with the book of Ecclesiastes? Does having a love for self increase the meaninglessness of life? What does having a love for God do? And so, it kind of goes back to what we were focusing on before, of that idea about the meaninglessness. I think it was up here. Well, I guess it was on that other page. But that idea about, the more that we have an idea of where we are the center of our own universe, then the more meaninglessness that we're going to have. The more that we have an idea about God being the center of our universe, the more meaningfulness that we have. And if nothing else, I hope that you have begun to see that from the book of Ecclesiastes. The book of Ecclesiastes to me is a really interesting book, a fascinating book, but it's one that you gotta understand it in order to see it. So, all right. Well, I thank you for being with us, and if you've been with us since since you've been with us since January, yeah, it's another one of those J months. If you've been with us since January looking at this, we've covered a lot of territory. This has been a pretty big study, and so I appreciate you hanging with it and being with it for the whole time. Again, what we're going to do is for the next 3 weeks, Tuesdays at 7 o'clock, we're going to continue to have our Facebook studies and hopefully get some of this other stuff with the virus all figured out. And we're going to be looking at just 3 different lessons in the life of Abraham. And so, I invite you to participate in that. And at the same time, I want you to be thinking about different Bible questions that you might have that we can start to take a look at in June, providing, of course, that we can, start to meet freely again and everything like that. So anyway, thank you for watching, and God bless.